All right. Hey, everyone. Hi, this is the Stephen D. Kelley Show. My name is Stephen D. Kelley. We're probably going to move a little bit fast tonight because the information is it's just really too much. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you want to help us out, that you have to use our PayPal, which is StephenKelley714 at gmail.com, and that's STEVENKELLEY at 714 at gmail.com. Okay, StephenKelley714 at gmail.com. All right. Now, I'm going to, and that's PayPal, of course. I'm going to dedicate tonight's show to Scott Ricard. And Scott is a former NSA guy, and I've had him on my show a few times. We had a little falling out, and mainly it was over Trump. And the thing about Scott is he knew a little bit more than I did about these things. I hate to admit. Well, I willingly admit. And he used to tell me about Simon Mogilevich and the Russian mafia and the things that Trump was involved in. And I dismissed all of it because I thought he was just anti-Trump at the time. I thought that was really a bad thing because it would promote Hillary. But he was really pro-Bernie, and I don't see Bernie as being any better. But anyway, Scott, this is for you. You were right. And the title of tonight's show is Felix Sater. Now, and I'm going to remind everybody real quick, if you haven't done it yet, go get your notepad and your pencil or pen and get ready. Do not expect to just listen to this and have it soak into your brain. You're going to want to take notes, and I dare someone out there to write down every single name that I put out. Okay? Those are all dots that need to be connected. And the first dot we start with is Felix Sater. Felix, F-E-L-I-X, Sater, S-A-T-E-R. He likes to call himself Moshe Bond, which, of course, is a Jewish reference. And Bond, of course, he thinks he's a private eye or a spy. But why are we even talking about him? Because of Trump. All right. How is he connected to Trump? Through his company called Bayrock Group, LLC, New York. And his company ran until 2008. Now, Trump, of course, had to deal with his Mueller investigation. And when you look at the Mueller investigation, you'll realize right away that there's no difference between the Mueller investigation and the 9/11 investigation. It was a whitewash. It was intended. There was no chance that Mueller ever intended to find anything because as FBI head, you're going to find out that this guy Sater here was a informant working with the FBI and the CIA, etc., during the same period of time that all the events took place that were being investigated during the Mueller report. So obviously the FBI knew quite a bit about what was really going on, but was never going to say anything because it was all secret. And we're going to talk about all those secrets tonight. We're going to name all these names. So what we're seeing tonight, this show, is a real Mueller report. Only you can call this the Kelley report or the Truth Cat report because Mueller's report was bullshit. But let's start and talk about this guy here, Felix Sater. Now, he was mentioned over 100 times in the Mueller report, this one guy, Felix Sater. Why is that? All right, in 1998, Felix Sater was busted for a $40 million fraud, a penny stock fraud, called a pump and dump. And basically what that means is by pump and dump is you take a company that has relatively no value and you pump it up and make everybody think that it's got a huge amount of value and huge amount of money-making opportunity. And basically what he did was he took a piece of stock that was something like 10 cents and he worked it up to like $20. But he made a lot of money, $40 million. But he got busted for this. And when he got busted, this was in New York. And he had to, he made a plea deal with the federal prosecutor. And we're going to talk about those guys. One of them, of course, that he was dealing with was Loretta Lynch, who happened to seal his records. Okay, so all of his records were sealed by Loretta Lynch. Now, so he was a FBI informant. Basically, he was a mafia snitch. That's what his main thing. But he was also a senior advisor to Trump. And he's extremely closely connected to Trump on his Soho project, which is a Soho project, of course, is a building that was put up as something like a $230 million combination hotel, whatever. Now, That you cannot dispute. But the funny thing is that Trump says he does not know this guy. He says that if he was in a room with him together, he wouldn't recognize the guy, which is funny because there's tons and tons and tons of pictures about this. Now, one of the things we're going to be proving tonight, and we're not looking to prove it, but when you look at the information, that information is going to prove one thing all on its own, and that is that the Russian mafia is the same thing as the Chabad-Lubavitch sect. So what it is the Jewish mafia, Russian mafia. It's a Russian Jewish mafia, Chabad cult sect. All right, and we're going to learn about the Chabad and what that means. But Mr. Sater is a zealous promoter and member of the Chabad movement and a practitioner of Kabbalah, mystical, what have you. He wears a little red thread on his arm. But we also suspect that he was a lobbyist for Putin, and that we know for sure that this meeting, one of the so-called meetings that the Trump family claims did not happen, that he was involved in, and the purpose of this was to generate progress on the Trump Tower Moscow project, otherwise known as Crocus City or Novo Manhattan. But the Russians, of course, wanted something from Trump, and what they wanted was concessions on Syria, eastern Ukraine. So basically, they were expecting the president to do something involving those areas. Obviously, there are two sides to those issues. There was a attorney, the U.S. Attorney, Department of Justice, New York. This is the assistant U.S. Attorney for the Department of Justice. His name is Andrew Weissman. Okay, Weisman. Yes, he's Jewish. But he was a member of the special counsel for the Mueller team. How do you figure? Okay, he was the guy that signed the cooperation agreement with Sater, working with Loretta Lynch for the Justice Department at the time. So in other words, here's the guy working for Loretta Lynch, the U.S. Attorney for the case of New York against Sater, completely aware of all the things that he had done, and he signed the agreement where Sater said, yes, I'm going to start working for you now. And yet here he is as a member of the special counsel of the Mueller team. Okay, so right away that's a conflict, and yet there it was. We should also remind everybody that Loretta Lynch was also the Attorney General under Obama, yes, but she was also the U.S. Attorney for, when she was the U.S. Attorney for New York, she also tried the HSBC Bank for money laundering for drug cartels. Now, money laundering is something that is, this show is all about money laundering. Make no mistake, you're going to see nothing but money laundering throughout, because you're going to realize that the entire world is one big patsy for taking their money, and this is what the mafia does. So the director of HSBC Bank that was being tried by Loretta Lynch was none other than Comey, the guy that would go on to become the FBI director. So here he is, a dirty banker, setting up a sweet deal with a dirty U.S. attorney for New York, and he becomes the FBI director. And at the same time, Loretta Lynch becomes attorney general. So both of them got kickbacks. We have to, think about that. They both hooked up Sater, and they both got kickbacks. And not only that, here's this Andrew Weissman over there dealing directly with Mueller. The FBI called Sater quarterback. That was their code name for this guy. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the Trump family tree, because you have to be aware of these things if you're going to understand the significance of why these connections were ever made in the first place. So if we go back to 1869, March 14th, 1869, that was when Frederick Trump was born, or Trumpf, or Drumpf, as they say in Germany. This is Donald's great-grandfather. Well, Mr. Frederick Trump, or Drumpf, came to the United States, and he made a fortune running brothels in the Yukon. So in other words, when all the miners were out there panning for gold, he would run the brothels, and he'd take the gold from them. Anyway, he made a fortune with his hookers, his prostitutes. Now, he married a woman, a Jewish woman. He went back to Germany and married a Jewish woman. Well, they had a child, and that child was born in October 10th, 1880. Now, for you people that are numerologists, I'm just going to mention that Frederick Trump is a 3. He's a he's a 325. Number one number there is a 3. Remember that. If you know anything about threes, you're going to know threes are partiers. So I'm not surprised to see a 3 involved with prostitution. Child Elizabeth was named Elizabeth Christ Trump. Trump, not Trump, but Trump with a P. And her name basically translated to vow for Christ to be trumped. Okay, that doesn't sound very good. We should mention that she died on June 6th, 1966. That's 6/6/66. Kind of interesting number. But before that happened, she had a son who was born in 1905, and her son was named Frederick Christ Trump. All right, that's Donald's father. Anyway, Frederick Trump's, so Donald's dad, his name translated out to King Christ Trumper. Okay, so there's that Antichrist thing going on again. In 1927, Elizabeth, his mother, incorporated the family business. Now remember, the family business was the money that came from the prostitution in the Klondike. They used that money to invest, and they essentially became slumlords, buying a whole bunch of property. Well, like I said, she died eventually, but before that happened, in 1946, Donald Trump was born. Now, we should look at his numbers. His numbers are 314. Which is interesting because his first number is a 3, also like his great grandfather there. So that means right away he's a partier, and he's, if you guys will pardon my expression, a fuckhound. But he was born on a blood moon, which is also very interesting. And it's funny because his father used to dump a bunch of money on him as a tax dodge, and he started doing that when he was like, I don't know, 2 years old or something like that. But he was a millionaire by 8, obviously not because he was in business, but because he used to get this money. His dad used to hide it. But the thing is that when he was like, I don't know what age, what do you do with an 8-year-old? You're $1 million. You probably go read comic strips and you buy switchblades. Well, that's what happened. He had a whole box full of switchblades. His dad found him and sent him to military school. So that's why he went to military school. But just for shits and giggles, I'm going to also mention that Felix Sater was born in 1966. There's that 66 thing again. Now, I also need to mention also that Frederick Christ Trump is he's a crypto supporter of Chabad. He's a Chabad movement. A lot of people say, what's up with the Jewish thing? Okay, the fact that Frederick Trump's, or Elizabeth Trump's mother was Jewish essentially makes her Jewish. Okay, that means that her children are Jewish. So Frederick Trump Christ is technically Jewish. And this is why he was into the whole Shabbat thing. Okay, for all you people think, but he was German. So what? There's German Jews. There's Russian Jews too. And we're going to be talking a lot about Russian Jews tonight. And one more thing before we move on, I want to mention in 1980, Mr. Trump bribed John Anderson, senator from Illinois, I believe, to run. He basically gave him money to convince him to run for office against, he was as an independent. I'm not sure if he was a Democrat or a Republican, but the point is that it was Reagan and Carter were running. So to help dilute Carter's vote, they got John Anderson in there. The only reason why they even did that was because somebody paid off Trump to do this. Now, you got to remember, Reagan was a Vesco guy, NSA guy. We're going to talk about Vesco. So obviously, he was the money guy behind that. Now, before I talk about the Chabad and all that, I want to mention Sater's rabbi, a guy named Shalom Paltiel. It's funny, there's a video out there right now where he's giving an award to Sater. And this award is a photograph of the Rebbe with a dollar bill. And the Rebbe, and you'll learn about what the Rebbe is when I tell you about the Chabad here really quick, but the significance is what these guys do, these Chabad guys do, is they have this messianic reverence for this head of their thing, the head rabbi, what they call the Rebbe, R-E-B-B-E. What they do is they'll take a dollar bill that belonged to the Rebbe, or he'll say he owned it. They'll pass out these dollar bills, and this is good luck. It's like, here I'm presenting you with a dollar bill that belonged to the Rebbe. And they believe that is going to bring you good luck, money, and a few other things. Protection. They think it's going to protect them. as I mentioned, this his rabbi gave him a Rebbe dollar, and in a way they consider this something like a mezuzah, which is a thing they put on their front door, which is supposed to protect the home. Now, apparently, Seder met the Rebbe as a child, but at the same time, he will tell everybody that he's not religious. Now, how could that be? He's so into this Chabad thing, and yet he says he's not religious. The reason why is because this is not a religion. This is a cult, and Chabad is based on the Pharisees. And if you know your Bible, you know what the Pharisees are. But let's talk about this Chabad Lubavitch. It was founded in 1775. I believe it was in the Ukraine. The guy that founded it was a guy named Rabbi Shneur Zalman. One of the things he did was wrote a book called the Tanya, Tanya, and that is their Bible. That's one of their holy books. And I should mention, this is important. In fact, before I talk about the Chabad, I think I'm going to talk about the Pharisees first. But the Pharisees in the Bible were a sect of Jews back during the time of King Solomon. And when the temple fell the first time and the kingdom split into two, the temple in the south, the country in the south, the Judeans, had these sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And when the temple was destroyed, the only one of these sects that survived was the Pharisees, because the Pharisees did not use the temple. The other ones required a temple, so their sects crumbled because they weren't able to do their rituals and whatnot without a temple, because they were in captivity in Babylon. But this did not affect the Pharisees because they didn't use a temple. And the other thing the Pharisees did do is they believed in a oral text. In other words, they didn't write everything down, and they didn't go by something that was in a book. So if your books were destroyed, it didn't matter, because they went by humans telling stories to other humans, and these humans would tell the stories to other humans. And this was a oral tradition, is what they called that. And the problem with this oral tradition is that it leads to interpretation. And when you get a messianic thing going on with these Rebbes, then everything he says turns into holy words, like the book, the Tanya. It should be noted that these guys, these Pharisees, have always been genocidal. They've always been anti-fellow Jew, and they for sure hate Christ. But it should be mentioned that when they returned to Judea to build the other temple, the other sects were gone. And when they built the temple, the temple was rebuilt by a sect that didn't even use the temple. It was a farce, okay? It was a farce. And the other thing is that when the Romans came and destroyed the temple the second time, it was the Pharisees that opened the door and let them in, because they wanted the Romans' help in wiping out the other guys so that they could be in charge. And this whole concept of wiping out the other guys so that they can be in charge is a reoccurring theme, because that's exactly what the Holocaust did. And as I'm going to tell you here very soon, the sixth Rebbe who was in occupied Poland. When I say occupied, I'm talking, let's see, what was it? 1938. In 1938, Hitler sent the sixth Rebbe from occupied Poland to Brooklyn. Okay, and the U.S. State Department helped him do it. Now, why did he do that? Because that was no different than when the Germans sent Lenin into Russia to cause the Russian Revolution and screw up that country. It's no different than when the CIA and France sent the Ayatollah Khomeini into Iran to screw up that country. This is how it's done. Basically, they knew that by doing that, Hitler's plan was to screw up this country. And the other thing is, it shows that Hitler was working with his sect, because the whole thing about this annihilation of many Jews was meant to further the aims of it was to set up the Holocaust so that they could get their Jerusalem back, and so that the Chabad could be in control. Chabad means in Hebrew wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And basically Lubavitch comes from a town in Ukraine. There's not that many of them. They're only 13% of the whole global Hasidic Jew population. That's not a whole lot. There's maybe 1 million Jews that will attend Chabad services, but there's only 95,000 actual members of Chabad. Obviously, if you look at the path of these guys, they've also have a presence in Rostov-on-Don, which is very close to the Ukraine right there, but it's inside, it's over the border in Russia. And obviously the New York thing, the Manhattan thing, that's their base now. Most of the Chabad people are Ashkenazi. Obviously, they're Ashkenazi. There are some Sephardic, but they're mostly Ashkenazi. But these are the people responsible for the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Also, it should be mentioned, and this is important when you look at a lot of the people that are becoming here, is that Lithuania is where Bolshevism and Zionism started. They both started in a couple of pair of Jewish clubs operating in Lithuania, and that stuff was exported. We should mention that the things that you could really associate with the Chabad movement is they're messianic, they're Talmudic, so you got to watch out for those Talmud scholars. They're mystic, which means that they believe in the satanic, spiritual, magic side, this Kabbalah thing. It's completely satanic. And they are Illuminati, and they are extremely Masonic. This is where the Masons and all that stuff comes from. I mean, look, 1775 and Illuminati, when did that start? But bottom line, you got to remember, these guys prey on other Jews because they want to be number one. They want Armageddon, and they want to use the Christians to get there. So all these evangelical Christians now that are so pro-Israel, you are being run by these guys right here, and they use the Scofield Bible, which is a bastardized reference Bible that has corrupted the church now for a good 100 years, or the Christians for a good 100 years. That's how they did it. And you should also remember that these guys are definitely the same people that are running Hollywood and are definitely connected to the Getty. Now, as far as Felix Sater is concerned, obviously he was very involved with Trump, but he's doing crazy things right now. And before we get into all this other stuff, I want to talk about a couple of things that he's done just here recently. Okay, and this might give you a little insight. There's a woman who he grew up with when they were teenagers, I guess, in Brooklyn, and her name is Stella Bulaknikov. Let me make sure I got that right. Yes, Stella Bulaknikov Stolper. Stolper is her ex-husband, and no one knows who the hell this guy is. You can't find anything about it. But anyway, this woman was a comedian. She was on season 4 of Last Comic Standing, and she lost. As soon as she got up on stage, they got rid of her. But she is a, well, let's just say she's a mover and shaker, and she started a company called Wicked Entertainment, and she is the manager for none other than Mariah Carey. And a lot of people know her for being all into butterflies. You should know what that means. MK Ultra. But she was girlfriend with Felix Sater, and she actually had Felix Sater at her house in 2019, where he lived shortly with a associate called Kalsom Cam, Kalsom Cam. Now, Kalsom Cam apparently was a computer hacker. But while they were there living in her house, they stole all her records and set up backdoors on her computers and her phones. So you think, why the hell did they do that? Do they need information on Mariah Carey? Well, it turns out that she had an assistant called Liliana Arazian, okay, Armenian. And basically this woman was basically in charge of recording private, film extortion material from Mariah Carey, who was also an MK Ultra Monarch victim. Mariah Carey sued this woman, of course. Her extortion thing did not work. This actually went to courts. But the thing is so what were they really looking for? Well, now this Stella was really mean to this Liliana. She actually Liliana sued Stella because Stella actually got on her once and peed on her and called her stuff like Armenian whore, the N-word, all kinds of crazy stuff. Oh, and at the same time, this is kind of weird, but Stella is famous for always saying things like fucking Israelis, fucking Jews, which is weird, But of course, if you're a Chabad, you probably hate Jews. It turns out that Stella also had she was like a cousin called Zarina Berbaki, and Zarina kept a secret account with $5 million. Now Stella claims that Zarina stole $5 million from her. Now, bear in mind, this stuff is going to be a recurring thing, this whole stealing thing. $8 million extortion, 5 secret accounts. Oh, and also Stella sued Mariah Carey for having to endure looking at Mariah Carey being naked too much when they were working together. Oh, and here's another tidbit. Stella she didn't like to shower, and she liked to make people smell her crotch to see if she was clean. But I guess somebody that has a company called Wicked Entertainment, that makes sense, right? Now, here's a guy, this is pretty screwy, but his name is Tony Rezko, and him and an Iraqi guy named Mahru owned some property in Chicago, and this property was riverfront property called the 78 in Chicago. Anyway, it was a mega development, and Sater, Mr. Snitch, while he was working for the government as a snitch, offered $175 million for this property, which is only worth about 65 million, 75 million max. We don't know why he was going to offer him all this money, but Rezko said no. Next thing you know, Rezko ends up in prison for 8 years. Gee, what happened? You said no to Sater. No, Sater, I won't take your exorbitant offer for my property. It's like something's wrong here. Something doesn't smell right. Next thing you know, Rezko's in jail. And not only that, but the Iraqi guy had to leave the country because he was Iraqi, of course. But he still owned the property, but he ended up selling it to someone else for $65 million. Oh, yeah, and he was also convicted in France of an illegal commission on an illegal oil deal. Here's a guy that Sater dealt with Trump. He was a financier for Trump's Soho project. And when I say financier, that means money being laundered. Okay, so remember, and I'm going to say, before I get too far into this, we're going to be talking about Yeltsin, but I want to remind you people, in the 1990s, when the Iron Curtain fell and Russia took a big dump, all the property, all the assets in that country got sold off for pennies on the dollar. Now, this is kind of like what happened when the Rothschilds took over England because of the end. They thought that Napoleon had won, where it didn't. This is the same kind of thing that causes that sort of thing to happen. That's sort of like what we call a pump and dump. Okay, remember that pump and dump thing, because someone's going to try to do that to our United States. They did it. They did it to Russia. The fall of the Iron Curtain, that was a pump and dump. And anyway, all the oligarchs, that's where all these billionaires came from, these oligarchs, because they bought up all these big monstrous companies for like nothing and then suddenly became all mega billionaires. And they had all this extra money because they work in bribery and all these funny business things like we'll talk about soon. And they got to put that money somewhere. That's where the money laundering comes in. So bear in mind, when I tell you about how much all these billionaires are worth tonight, I want you to be advised that this is what they're worth on paper. We know that they're laundering their money, and we know they've got shitloads of money someplace else. So when I'm done with this whole project, you're going to see where that somewhere else is, because we're going to trace the entire course of all the money in the world, where it's being laundered to and who's doing it. But Mr. Tamir Sapir here was born in 1914. He's an older guy, but he's got some family that were pretty active with the Trumps also. One of them is Alex Sapir, and one is Zena Sapir Rosen. But anyway, right after the Yom Kippur War, this guy decided to move to Kentucky. He's originally from the Soviet Georgia. He's Jewish, obviously. But when he died in 2014, he was worth $1.4 billion. But before that, he worked with Sater in the 90s in the market. The 2006 is when they built Trump Soho. Okay, so his money, some of his $1.4 billion, or the money that he was trying to hide, went into Trump Soho. Now, he's filmed there. He's been filmed at Trump Soho with Sater, as have all his children. Now, Sater just recently sold his home in New York for $2.5 million. That was February 2019. There's another guy that we want to mention here who's involved in Bayrock and all that, a very big money guy, and his name is Tevfik Arif, Tevfikarif. And his big thing was chrome processing. Now, this guy here is a Turk. If you look at him, and in Turk is kind of a funny way of saying our Ashkenazi. But the thing is about these Turks, a lot of them, is that they have this thing called Donmed Jews. That's a crypto Jew. That's what it is. That's what you call a Turkish person that is Jewish but pretends to be something else. The guy that was responsible for the Armenian genocide was such a crypto Jew. But anyway, that's what this guy is. But he made his money in Chrome, as I said. Let's see. Let me make sure I get this right here. Yeah, this is hard. I mean, I'll get better, trust me. But there was a fraud. This is kind of big because this is where Trump gets involved in something that's totally illegal. But there was a group called the FL Group out of Iceland. Now, remember Iceland, you think, what's he doing in Iceland? Okay, that is a shell. Well, a lot of times what these guys do is we'll set up a company, and the idea is that the company is intended to fail. They'll put a whole bunch of money into a company that's intended to fail, and then when it fails, they take all the money, their so-called losses, and then whoever else invested loses it, and that way they get to hide the money. That's another way of laundering. But anyway, this particular company, the FL Group, was in Iceland, but a lot of the people involved were from Kazakhstan, and we know for sure that Simon Mogilevich was involved in this particular deal, but so was Trump, and so was another guy named Alexander Mashkevich. Now, this agreement actually they all had to sign it before they could create this company. All these players, all these investors had to sign, and when they did that, they had to know that this thing was being set up to fail. Now, of course, when it did fail, shortly thereafter, Trump says, oh, gee, I didn't know it was going to fail. Okay, so when you look at all his bankruptcies, that's what that is. That's money laundering. But if we look at some of the names that were involved in this particular deal right here, not only do we have Felix Sater, Tevfik Arif, and Alexander Mashkevich, who's also a big owns the chromium mines. He's a huge Jewish leader, this guy right here, Mashkevich, huge. He's totally a business partner with Trump. He worked with Trump on this Trump Manhattan project that we're going to talk about. And these guys are also connected to another guy called Aris Agalov, Agalarov. It's Aglarov. So all these guys are involved in this. There's another company involved here, and this is connected to this Alexander Mashkevich, and it's called ERG, and that's in Amsterdam. And obviously, when you see companies in Amsterdam, it's because in Amsterdam they allow what they call mailbox companies, which means that people can set up companies left and right, and nobody checks to see if they're legal or if the money that they are putting in the bank or taking out of the bank has anything to do with any transactions actually taking place in the country. Now, there's another guy that's involved. His name is Viktor Krapunova, Krapunova, and his wife Leah, who actually happens to be a Kazakhstan TV star news announcer. Now, these guys both put in $40 million to this, okay? It should be mentioned here also that this guy, Mashkevich, Aris Agalov, were both busted in Turkey with Tarif Zik for running prostitution on his yacht. He had a yacht, and they had Russian prostitutes, and they called it a sex party on the yacht, and they used this sex party to close deals. This is a common thing, using a yacht in the middle of nowhere or a hotel or a casino filled with hookers to close deals. It should be mentioned about Mr. Sater, who's a relatively small Jewish guy. He said of himself, I'm not a big guy, I'm not very tough, I don't have a gun, but I have a secret weapon, and that is greed. He will use greed to get you to do what he wants. He will come to you and he'll say, hey, and this is, imagine him talking to Donald Trump. He'll say something like, we're going to make a lot of money together, or we're going to make millions. Or in Trump's case, he might say, we're going to make billions. But that's what he did. And these greedy fucks will also do that. I know exactly what that's like because it wasn't too long ago when I started getting into all this activism that I had Israeli money come to me and say, oh, you got to help us do this project. Like, I'm going to stop talking about Israel. Now, Viktor Krapunov, V-I-K-T-O-R, Krapunov, I'm never going to get that right. He's not just anybody. He was a governor and a mayor in Kazakhstan, but he was busted for fraud and laundering, money laundering, for running this Dutch mailbox company. Now, it should be mentioned that the Dutch mailbox companies run 4 trillion euros a year through these companies as trusts. They call them trusts. And this is really big. The money always went to this company, Bayrock. Okay, that was Sater's company. And what they did was Sater or Krapenov set up a company with Sater in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and they called it Bayrock BV. So that was a shell company in order for Bayrock in New York to funnel money to Amsterdam. Well, here's where it gets fun. Another company was formed, and this company was formed as the parent company of Bayrock BV, and it was called Kazbay BV. And you guys write this one down. This is a big one. Kazbay BV, and that's like limited or LLC, but BV, of course, is B period V as in Victor period. Well, this company, Kazbay, was set up to none other by the law firm owned by Rudy Giuliani, who at the time that this was done was an attorney for Trump. Now, why is Trump's attorney setting up a fake company in Amsterdam and Switzerland? Why? Why? A shell company or a mailbox company. Why does Trump need his attorney? And his name's not on here anywhere. Okay, they've got Dutch people's names on this, of course. And like I said, because it's registered in Switzerland and Amsterdam, you're not going to get any money. But the bottom line is what they do is they're running the money from New York to Kazbay, and from Kazbay, it goes to Bayrock BV. And from Bayrock BV, it's going to go to places that we will get to here very soon. Eventually, it ends up in China. But it ends up in China as in Hong Kong, and we know who owns that. The Queen, whether they say she doesn't or not. But anyway, as I mentioned, this Capanova woman, husband Victor, he was also a former energy minister. Well, remember those Panama Papers that came out recently? In the Panama Papers, they identified a whole bunch of shell companies, just like the ones in Amsterdam, but these ones they were Swiss. And guess whose name came up? Those two, along with many, many others. Now, I should remind you then, though, that in the 90s, of course, Yeltsin was the guy in charge, and he was really responsible for helping Russia transition from this Soviet communist system into what it is today, for better or for worse. All of these guys were involved. These mobsters, they were all involved. If you look at the people that were connected to Yeltsin back in the day, who became an oligarch and who didn't, some of them became good guys and some of them became bad guys. But you got to remember also, and this is a very, very important thing to remember with these mobsters, that there is no honor amongst these people at all. If one guy is fighting another guy, does not mean that they're not on the same side, and vice versa. So there's going to be constant shit like that going on constantly, not to mention murders. But when the Mueller report started, a few things happened. You know, obviously Sater's name was all over the Mueller report, but Trump, of course, he washed everything. But before he did that, the government basically came to him and said, you know, what are you doing with this mobster in your Trump Tower living in the, living down the floor beneath you or whatever? Not the floor, obviously, he can't afford that, but his office space was like one floor down from Donald Trump's office. They say it's only a couple doors down or the hall, but I think it's probably the floor below Donald Trump. So what happened? Trump said, I'll take care of it. What did he do? He took his whole family. Okay, when I say whole family, I mean he took himself, Ivanka, Donald Jr., and the other one, Eric, and they took all their lawyers, and they marched down to Bayrock, down the company down in the same building. Remember, there's a reason why all these companies are in the same building, because that way they get to do this stuff, and nobody sees it. But anyway, the whole damn family and their lawyers went down there, and instead of telling this guy to get out of our building, you damn mobster, what did they do? They said, you know what? You're bringing on a lot of heat. You're going to need to pay up and give us more money. It's going to cost you more money now. So they extorted this Sater guy to continue with the deal. Remember, the big thing, of course, was when they say Trump Moscow. Remember, Trump Moscow? Let me just tell you what Trump Moscow is before we go too much further. I mean, we're going to talk about it, Crocus, but Trump Moscow basically was a small peninsula. They were going to actually take a little spit of land and model after a mini Manhattan, and they were going to have high-rise buildings and huge department stores and malls and things like this going on. They were going to dump huge billions and billions of dollars into this project, and as you'll see, the reason why they do that is because real estate is how they launder money. And if you look around, you'll see, like where I live, we have all sorts of buildings that are depressed and for lease, but at the same time, they're building new buildings. You think, why the hell would they be doing that? Why you tear down one and build another? Well, it's because the money that they've got here is digital money. It's on paper. It's numbers on paper. It's clicks on a computer. They need to convert that clicks on a computer into real equity, such as property, and that property must have buildings and improvements. So remember that. Infrastructure. Very, very important. Anyway, right after that meeting where Trump said he wanted more money out of Sater, the next thing he did is removed Sater's name from all the Trump documents. And also, the company Bayrock, Sater left it. That doesn't mean that Trump stopped having Bayrock as an advisor, but Sater left it. Now, remember, during the Mueller investigation, when he was asked about Sater, he said no comment. One of the things that Sater is famous for, of course, when he calls himself a spy, James Bond. First of all, I want to point out that when you're a felon and you're busted, you're a con man, you've been busted for stealing people's money, and the corrupt Department of Justice makes a deal with you to give you immunity and protection to seal your records in exchange for you going around snitching on everybody, which is what he was. You don't call yourself James Bond. That's an insult to the rest of us. But one of his connections, and of course he had to use all these connections, including all these mobsters, but some of his connections were old Soviet era people, generals, people connected to Putin. And he used this, of course, to get, like, for one thing he did was he retrieved some Stinger missiles. This has nothing to do with Russia, of course. This is dealing with Taliban. But one of the guys he dealt with was a guy named Evgeny Shmykov. And this is a guy that's very connected to Putin, and he is an ex-Soviet general. But during the Afghan war, he was an anti-Taliban intelligence officer. And what's interesting about this guy is not only is he the big military connection for Sater, but he is also the guy that Sater used to get the visas for Cohen and Trump to go to Moscow. And of course, Cohen eventually didn't go. I don't even know if Trump went. But anyway, this guy got tasked with the job to getting the things. Now, of course, we're going to talk about a lot of mobsters, but one of the biggest mobsters of all, who's connected directly to Sater, is a guy named Semyon Mogilevich. Now remember, Semyon was definitely connected to Trump. He was at a meeting that Trump was at, and he was an investor in Trump projects. There's no question at all that this guy is a mobster. He's wanted by Interpol. He's in a country, the FBI took him off the 10 most wanted list because they couldn't extradite him. Gee, I think that's the only reason. But anyway, the big thing that Semyon Mogilevich did back in the day was he created he did a $1 billion fraud. He created a fake company called YBM Magnex. It was supposed to be a Hungarian company, and they set it up in Canada. Anyway, he did the old pump and dump. The stock went from a penny up to $20. Anyway, needless to say, he made a shitload of money. He had a bunch of partners involved in this. One of them was named Igor Fishman. Another one was Jacob Bogatin, and he's a big mobster. But these guys are investors in the project. And another guy named Anthony Anatoly Tsoura, Tsoura. Okay, these guys are Israeli citizens. They are connected to a company called Aragon Company Limited, United Trade Limited. This company was busted for defrauding Hungary. they're a total offshore company. They're in the Channel Islands of England. So whenever you hear Channel Islands, Caribbean, Aruba, anything like that, money laundering. And also, there was another company that these guys were connected, United Trade Limited. That's a Cayman, West British Indies. Their money is coming from Budapest. Then there's another one here, Technology Distributors Limited, which is another offshore slush fund, and it's located in the Isle of Man. And it's also connected to another company, Oregon, Origon Company Limited, that we just mentioned. They're also in the Caribbean. They're primarily dealing with the British European market, but still, there was something involving Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to come up. You're going to notice that these mafia guys, a lot of them, especially the ones around the East Coast, they're going to be operating out of Pennsylvania, New York, Chicago. Well, Detroit, of course, is a big one, but Connecticut and New Jersey, those are big states. But the five families are primarily in that area. Simon Moglevich also had a partner, a guy named Ivan Fursin, Fursin. His name's going to come up quite a bit. He had a bank called Income Bank, and he merged another bank, merged that with Bank Mentap, and they became the Bank of New York, believe it or not. But anyway, he got busted in 1998 for laundering $10 billion. And he was also busted in Europe for $5 billion for oil and gas fraud. Now, again, I just want to remind you, just because we're going to keep a running tab here, these guys I'm talking about, they're all Jewish. Okay. Oh, I should also mention that Simon Moglevich, he's really big in arms trafficking. When you think of the movie Lord of War, you got to think of these guys. Okay. Also prostitution. 2009, he was busted in Russia for tax evasion, but he walked, of course. His big thing that made him really big is that he was a money launderer for a gang, a particular gang located in a western portion of Moscow. It's like a suburb of Moscow. They call it a outer region, I think is what they call it. But the gang is called the Solnitsevskaya. And I'm sorry, mobsters, if I mispronounced the name of it, but basically what that means is something to do with sun. It's like the sun community or something like that. I wanted to tell you about Simon Moglevich's gang. There's a big gang in Russia. I'll tell you about that. But before that, I'm going to tell you about Ivan Hennady. Okay, there's no way I can pronounce this guy. Okay, let's just call him Ivan Fursin, that Fursin guy that I was telling you about here. Okay, let's see. He's worth, anywhere 5 to 7 million. He's a Ukrainian politician, but he was also head of the security service. And he was also had a bank called the Valenti Bank. And he started a company called Lucicle Consultants Limited, and it was based in Cyprus. This is the bank that was used to feed money to Paul Manafort and his assistant, Rick Gates. So the connection to the payoff, that money that went to them, we'll explain when we talk about both those individuals what the money was all about. But both this Fursin and the other guy, Firtash, Dmitry Firtash, and this other guy, I know these names all sound the same, were responsible for funneling the money, which ended up being something like 16 million to Paul Manafort. Now, bear in mind, Paul Manafort did not go to jail for the money. He went to jail for lying to Mueller about Trump's involvement in Trump Tower Moscow because he was off by 2 months. That's some bullshit there, but he went to jail for the bullshit so they don't have to talk about the real thing, which is the money laundering. But there's more. Fursin is also the chairman of another bank called the JSC Misto Bank in Odessa, Ukraine. Okay, now remember, that's where the Chabad operates. Anyway, it turned into the Nadra Bank. But they went and bought a company called Ross oh God, I can't pronounce it. It's an energy company, Ross UKR Energo. And it was purchased by the Firtash Group, officially, Dmitry, the other guy I was just telling you about. But it was financed by Fursin. Okay? Now, we should mention here that Dmitry is wanted for bribery in India for a deal involving Boeing. His attorney for that bribery scandal was in Chicago court was none other than Dan Webb and Lanny Davis. You might remember Lanny Davis from working as the chief counsel for Bill Clinton. Well, Dan Webb is also famous for defending Nixon. He is a total CIA, NSA attorney. He's defended some other famous people, but yeah, mostly Clinton. Anyway, so these are, whenever you see somebody being indicted, look at the attorney. Look at who the attorney has worked with in the past, and that'll give you an idea. Kind of like when your attorney is Rudy Giuliani or somebody like that, or say Roy Cohn, or I don't know. We're going to come into some other guys that are really fun. But anyway, this Ross UKR Energo, it's registered in Switzerland. Okay, that should tell you something. It's 50% owned by Gazprom. That's a huge corporation in Russia. The other 50% is owned by this Dmitry Firtash and Ivan Fursan, okay, who of course are connected to Mogilevich. Now again, Fursan also owns a company in the Ukraine called Naftogaz. We're going to talk about Naftogaz too. There is some stuff. Both this guy Dmitry Firtash was definitely involved in some of the politics here recently in the Ukraine. And I should mention that these guys at one time, prior to the fall of the Ukraine here recently, were the sole supplier. Okay, these guys were the sole supplier. So again, when we talk about the politics of the new empire in Ukraine, the Poroshenko regime versus the previous regime, it's difficult to understand who's on whose side sometimes. But money has no eyes; it doesn't care about politics. But this guy Firtash was sued by Yulia Tymoshenko, who was tried to become a premier over there, for stealing 6.3 billion cubic meters of gas. Now remember, we're talking about natural gas now. There's another guy here, Seder associate, named Aras Aglarov that we mentioned earlier, and he has a son named Emin. And Emin and Aras were both involved with Trump, and Emin's actually kind of a character. He's a pop singer over there in Azerbaijan. He still looks like a mobster, but whatever. It's like, Dad, I want to be somebody important, like a pop singer. It's like, okay, son. But he ran the Crocus Group. Now, the Crocus Group was essentially the main company for this Trump thing in Manhattan, or in Russia. Now, the real estate, or the whole area that was being developed, was going to be called Crocus City, or otherwise known as Novo Manhattan. So obviously the Crocus Group and all the little investors are involved in that. And all Trump was going to do was build one Trump Tower skyscraper in there. The rest of it was probably going to be done by the mobsters, but having the Trump Tower skyscraper was going to be like a magnet fixture that would give status to the stupid thing and make them feel like they had a little New York in Moscow. Now here's the thing to remember, if I didn't say this earlier, the entire economy of Russia is equal to the economy of New York. So when you think about money laundering and moving money out of the country, it shouldn't be too surprising that they do that by moving the money into New York. Buying New York real estate was the number one way to launder money in the 90s. The other way was to build casinos in Vegas. Now, again, if you look at who owns the casinos, you're going to see the mob. Obviously, Trump owns, 3 casinos? Well, we're going to look at all the casino owners tonight because they all have some certain characteristics that all seem to be a common denominator. But it should be mentioned, though, that there was this meeting, a very important meeting. Let me see where it took place. Trump Tower, that's right. This is one of those famous meetings that you hear about that was attended by Valenitskaya, who's a woman, we'll get into her, Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Manafort, and Emin. Emin, of course, is the son of Aris Agalarov. Agalarov. Oh, yes, and Sater, of course, was in on this meeting. But this meeting was to set up Crocus Group. Immediately after the meeting, and of course they track this stuff, 1.2 million was wired to a bank in New Jersey by Aris Agalarov. This is right after the meeting. So, in other words, whatever they talked about at the meeting, he dropped $1.2 million immediately afterwards. Now, the thing about this Agalarov guy is that Trump and him have some serious connections. They did the Miss Universe thing in Moscow. This is the guy responsible for paying for it. He's also an investor in Trump golf courses. All right, we're going to be talking about Trump golf courses. Now, the security service, the Russian FSB, had those emails from Hillary. And of course, Trump made references to that and asking Putin to please find it. Bottom line is there's a lot of misdirection going on. Just remember that. And for whatever reason, WikiLeaks is being listed in this list of Russian agents, and I don't personally believe that. There's another guy. Oh, by the way, as I mentioned, yeah, the last guy, Jewish also. That was okay. Peter Avin. Here's another guy, Aven. He's also connected to a guy named Roman Abramovich. They're both going to come up here real quick. Peter, of course, is Jewish, Lithuanian, born in Moscow, born in 1955. And he's the head of Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank. And of course, he's hooked up to this Roman Abramovich, who is worth 4.6 billion, probably more like 5.1 billion. Okay. And there's another thing here called the Genesis Philanthropy Group. And they're also, what do? They donate money to Russian Jewish identity. But that's another thing you got to look at when you look at these. The philanthropy, all these guys are philanthropists. That means they give money to something. There's a reason for them doing that. There's another guy here, Konstantin Kilimnik, Kilimnik, born in 1970, relatively young guy, Ukrainian Jew, very pro-Russia. Works for Putin as, well, before he worked for Putin, he worked as a GRU interpreter. That's the... look it up yourself. But anyway, he was born in Ukraine. He was involved with a banker called Steve Calk, C-A-L-K, Bank of Chicago, and he was also responsible for funneling this money to the Manafort team and Rick Gates. They're involved in lobbying effort. Heavy as Ukrainians, one of their thing is they're trying to do everything they can to protect the East, actually, and to try to they were trying to lobby to get the Trump to stop them from arming the Ukrainian Nazis. But they're also very connected to Viktor Yanukovych. That's the bald guy, one of the guys that was very pro-Hillary Clinton. But anyway, he was the president of Ukraine in 2010, and these are the people who are basically responsible for putting him in there. Now, the Steve Calk guy, as I mentioned, also Jewish, basically he bribed Trump and Manafort for a job. He thought that by being involved as this federal banker in Chicago, working for the Federal Savings Bank in Chicago, he thought that by funneling this money to Trump, that somehow that should earn him a job in the Trump administration. He actually went so far as to send a list of all the jobs that he thought he should have or he would be appropriate for. But he was indicted in New York for approving the loan to Manafort, okay, to $16 million. And bear in mind, this money, it didn't just come in one big check. It came in a whole bunch of checks, bit by bit, $1 million here, $1 million there, whatever. But he was the banker that did all this. But it should also be mentioned that this same guy is also an economic advisor to Trump's campaign. In 2016, he was one of Trump's campaign advisors, economic advisors. And here he is busted for this. So, that's kind of weird. Busted for funneling money to Manafort, yet working as a campaign advisor. And then when it was all done, he thought he should get something. He wanted to be a Treasury Secretary, Defense Secretary, whatever he could get. There was another guy named Doug Elliman of the Vector Group. They were involved in a bank scam that failed for $2 million. But Vector Group is run by a guy named Howard Lorber, who is connected to Kushner, who was involved in this deal right here. Both Lorber and Koch were on this Trump Economic Council. I know that's a funny connection, but the thing is that Howard Lorber, Bronx Jew, is worth like $95 million. And he was the CEO of this Vector Group, which was worth about $1.7 billion. And the Vector Group isn't a small thing. It owns stuff like Liggett Company, which is the number 4 cigarette maker in the world. He's also the CEO of Nathan's Hot Dogs. His associate, Douglas Elliman, that's another company. Douglas Elliman, that's not associate, that's a company. But that's a real estate company, and that real estate company, Douglas Elliman, is the number 1 New York real estate company with 4,000 brokers in New York and 300 in Florida. Okay, remember, real estate. Think about all these things. These are Donald Trump, real estate, building development, okay? Think tax breaks, etc., okay? Donald Trump made this guy a chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Council, or whatever that was worth. This guy here is for sure tied to the Crocus Group. He's also got a partner called Philip Frost. Oh, I should mention that this Vector Group has another company called Landenberg Thalmann, also known as Castle Brands. This is a financial company, but they use this financial company to basically pump money to this guy named Philip Frost, who was at one time the richest man in real estate and the highest paid CEO in South Florida. Now, why is that important? Because Philip Frost is connected to Lorber. He's also a Jewish guy, and he's connected to Donald Trump. And it should be also mentioned, which is interesting here, but he went to the University of Pennsylvania, but he ended up at the University of Paris. But whenever you see somebody at the University of Pennsylvania, I want you to remember Sandusky and the fact that that entire state is riddled with pedophiles. Anyway, this guy Philip Frost is worth $5 billion. And of course, he's connected to the Crocus Group. He retired in 2018, but he was involved in 2018. The reason why he retired, why did he retire? Because he was involved in a $27 million penny stock fraud, a pump and dump. Let's look at some of the companies that this guy's involved in. Key Pharmaceuticals, iVax Corp, sounds like vaccination, Teva Pharma, Protalix Biotherapy, Acuity Pharma, Colorado Crystal Pharma, Muscle Pharma, RFS Pharma. Oh, and it should also be mentioned that he has interest in a company called Drone Aviation. And get this, he was the boss of the National Cancer Institute. Now, how do you do that when you're a shareholder in Liggett Cigarettes? That's a good one. Oh, yeah. And he likes to give money, scholarships to Israeli students to come to the United States. Anyway, he's involved in Crocus. Here's a good one for you. I love this guy. Stephen Hoffenberg, alleged Trump donor. Obviously Jewish. He's very Jewish, but now he calls himself a born-again Christian. Oh, it's funny because he says, "Don't call me a liar. That's an insult to my new religion." He's actually said that. Anyway, not only is he a Trump donor, but he lives in Trump Tower with all the other hooligans. Anyway, this guy made his money. This is a good one. Well, he got busted for a $475 million Ponzi scheme. All right. His company was called TowerInvestors.com. he had a junior partner named Jeffrey Epstein. Right before he got busted for this $475 million scam, Epstein quit. Smart guy. I should also mention that he owned Post Publishing and Buzz in the New York Post. These are tabloids, which he sold to News Corp. That's, Rupert Murdoch. He sold that in 93 to Rupert Murdoch. That's Fox. Well, anyway, he was convicted in 95 and he was released in 2013, and he was ordered to pay $463 million in restitution. Obviously, he doesn't have any money. He's got nothing except somehow he manages to live in Trump Tower. But he started, allegedly, in 2016, a super PAC for Donald Trump called Get Our Jobs Back. And he had some interesting partners in this super PAC. One of them was a guy named Richard A. Lepoutre. Richard A. Lepoutre is the guy that owns LinkedIn, as well as a few other things. And he was going to donate $50 million in services. Now, that sounds like a scam. Anyway, these guys have a spokesman, a guy called Theodore Foutsis. You're going to hear his name pop up a lot. But anyway, Lepoutre was a Dutch guy. Oh, there's that Amsterdam thing again. Well, he started a company called WHAM, W-H-A-M. And WHAM was started because it was to take over all the debts of all the people expecting restitution from Jeff Hoffenberg. But guess what they're going to do? They're trying to say that Jeffrey Epstein now is responsible, and they're trying to recover that money from Jeffrey Epstein. So WHAM is they're after Jeffrey Epstein now for $463 million in restitution for the Tower Investments Ponzi scam. You don't hear that anywhere. Now, here's a fun guy. This guy's a Sater handler. This is the guy that was the handler for Sater from the FBI. And he's in New York. He was a New York senator at one time, but he's Jewish, of course. He's a great grandnephew of Mel Brooks. His name's Todd Kaminsky. Kaminsky. Anyway, he's a U.S. federal prosecutor and a senator from New York. This is a guy that worked under Loretta Lynch as a federal prosecutor. And he was the guy that's, let's see, what did he do? He's also a Democrat. He became a Democrat state senator for Long Beach in 94, but 92 he did that. But he was also involved in the fun thing with HSBC and Comey. Remember that? Anyway, so he made the deal with Felix Sater. Now remember, this is guy's FBI. He was a handler. And what did Sater do? He went after Al-Qaeda. He went after the Russian mob, La Cosa Nostra. He went after the five families. Bonanno, Genovese, Gambino. There's a few interesting stories here about this Kaminsky guy. The reason why he became a New York State senator is because he beat a guy called Dean Skelos, S-K-E-L-O-S, Republican. But Skelos, the reason why he was able to beat this guy conveniently was because Skelos got busted for bribery, extortion, and fraud. And he was prosecuted by somebody, and I want you to remember this guy because he's a good guy, and his name is Preet Bharara. I can't pronounce it, but first name is P-R-E-E-T, last name B-H-A-R-A-R-A. Bharara. Anyway, he was a prosecutor. He was a Obama appointee, but he was the guy that busted this Skelos guy. Oh, I wanted to get to, before I tell you more about Preet Bharara or Todd Kaminsky, I'm going to tell you about this Russian mafia dude called Oleg Deripaska. This guy comes up a lot with Paul Manafort. Another Jewish guy. Now this guy's closely connected to Boris Yeltsin. And he had a big company called Basic Elements. This is another oligarch. He's worth $28 billion. He also was responsible for giving $10 million to Paul Manafort. Apparently some of that money came from this guy. He made his money in aluminum, energy, and financial services. Yeah, financial services, so he could hide the money he made in the aluminum and the energy. But you'll notice a lot of these oligarchs are very heavily into precious metals, aluminum, all these, commodities, if you will. Oleg had an attorney Mark Kasowitz, another Jew. Mark Kasowitz is also an attorney for Trump. Isn't that interesting? Trump shares an attorney with Oleg Deripaska, a Russian Jewish oligarch. Interesting. Anyway, there was a deal here with Oleg working with this Kasowitz, this attorney. They were working with the CIA to try to free this guy, Robert Levinson. Now, Robert Levinson was a CIA asset being held by Iran between 2008 and 2009. But Oleg worked with the FBI and with Iran to get this guy released. And what happened? Hillary got in the way and blocked the deal. And eventually everything went away in 2011. They forgot about it. Now, another thing about Oleg here and his $28 billion is in 2006, he made a bid to buy Chrysler. He wanted to come here to the U.S. and put that deal together. But what happened? Hillary. They revoked his visa. They said he was involved with organized crime and money laundering. Wow, they should talk. But it should be mentioned here that Oleg is very closely connected to Putin, and he's also very closely connected to Nathaniel Rothschild. We mentioned Mark Kasowitz, Trump's lawyer. Now, Mark Kasowitz, Kasowitz, is a Polish-Russian Jew. And he's from Connecticut, fun state, Connecticut. We'll talk about Connecticut. Well, anyway, what did Mark Kasowitz do? First of all, he made a whole bunch of money in scrap metal. Remember that. Also, as an attorney, he handled all of Trump's divorces as Trump's personal attorney up until 2017. Now, this guy's very well known for being an alcoholic. So much so that when some stranger gave him some shit on the internet once, he attacked him with emails saying shit like, "Watch your back, bitch." Anyway, bottom line is he's unstable, and a lot of people feel he's ineligible for federal security, yet there he is. He went to Yale and the Cornell Law School. Now remember, Yale, Skull and Bones. Who else went to Yale? Mueller, Kerry, Bush. That's Illuminati. He also defended Bill O'Reilly for his sex suit. And not only that, he defended the Port Authority of New York in 2005 against the victims of 9/11. He was trying to actually make sure they got less money. And at the behest of Donald Trump, well, actually, he was the guy that told Donald Trump to fire U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara. And as he said to Donald Trump, that guy's going to get you. So Preet was fired March 11th, 2017 on the orders of this guy, Kasowitz. Remember, he represents Oleg Deripaska, who gave Paul Manafort money, and also Oleg represents Cyberbank, who we're going to talk to, SBER, that's like Siberian Bank, which is the number one bank in Russia, something that's under sanctions. So these are some terrible connections here. Now, we should also mention that this Kasowitz guy, Trump's attorney, likes to donate money to political causes. Who does he donate money to? Let's see. Trump, of course, recently. But before Trump, he gave money to Obama, Biden, Schumer, and Harry Reid. Why Harry Reid? Well, we know because he's a corrupt guy that helps the casinos. Now let's talk about Preet Bharara, the good guy. Obviously, this guy's Indian. He's not Jewish. But he was pretty good about winning his cases. Let's see, what did he do? He took out 100 Wall Street executives for insider trading. That probably pissed off a few people. He fined four of the largest banks, including Citibank and Bank of America. And he shut down hedge funds worth billions of dollars. Yeah, we know all about hedge funds. He also liked to convict some other very, very famous people. He was responsible for convicting Bernie Madoff. We're going to talk about him real soon. And he convicted Sheldon Silver, another Jew, Speaker of the New York Assembly, Bernie Madoff's obviously Jewish. And he convicted that guy, Dean Skelos, who was the majority leader of his party in that state. And he was going after Andrew Cuomo before he got shut down. Sessions told him to quit. He said no. So Trump fired him March 11, 2007. All right, I'm going to tell you about Sergei Magnitsky, because you need to understand this, the Magnitsky Act, because the Magnitsky Act is the act that Congress imposed on Russia in order to create their sanctions. Anyway, Sergei Magnitsky died in 2009 in jail. He was refused medical treatment for a pancreatic issue, but basically what happened is he uncovered fraud, money laundering, $230 million in fraud against Russia by the Russians. Now, he worked for a firm called Hermitage Capital, which is run by another guy named William Browder, and he's an American, and he runs his firm out of London, and this is an investment fund. Anyway, when he uncovered this fraud, they, instead of throwing away the people that were committing the fraud, they threw his ass in jail, where he subsequently died. Well, as a response to that, Bill Browder realized that in Russia, money is more important than life, and he started a campaign to help remember Sergei. And the result of that is this Magnitsky Act, which puts the sanctions on Russia. And this Magnitsky Act is actually being done in 7 countries right now. But what it does is it goes after specific individuals and entities like banks and oligarchs, as opposed to saying Russia in general. So what happened? Putin turned around and he said, okay, you can't adopt no more Russian children. That was his thing. So whenever you hear somebody trying to fight the Magnitsky Act, usually they'll try to call that a pro-adoption bill, which is bullshit because that's a smokescreen. But it turns out that Putin's assets are in banks that have these sanctions, and those monies or funds are offshore. Putin has been trying to get this Bill Browder guy to Russia. He's been trying to indict him because obviously he's trying to shut this thing down, because he thinks he's trying to suggest that what's really going on at Hermitage Capital is they're the ones stealing money and tax evading and all that, but that's bullshit. He went to Interpol and said, bring me this guy, and Interpol said, nah, this case is purely political. Well, anyway, just recently there was a not a TV presentation, but a press conference where Donald Trump and Putin were together speaking somewhere, and we're going to mention that. Putin brings this guy's name up at this press conference. He offers Trump cooperation with the Mueller investigation. We'll give the Mueller guys whatever you guys want. But this guy's got Putin rattled. Interpol will not arrest him. So he complains to Trump. Let's talk about Hermitage Capital. First of all, they gave Hillary $400 million, supposedly. Putin says that. Putin's trying to say that they gave, in other words, we're supposed to be angry at them because Putin says that they gave Hillary money. Well, if you look at Hillary, she got money from practically everybody on the Trump administration. But hey, there's another outfit called Ziff Brothers that was involved, and of course, Putin is saying that these guys were the people responsible. That's a New York investment firm responsible for laundering the money that went to Hillary. I don't know if that's true or not. Another big bank over there is called the VTB Bank, and their headquarters is in Moscow, of course, but it's also very closely in Ukraine. They have $214 billion in assets, and they're founded in 1990. 1990, remember, there's that Yeltsin thing. They're run by a guy named Andrei Kostin, who's another very closely connected to Sater and Trump. He's got a bank called the Guta Bank, Guta, which is also under sanction. The sanctions were instituted by Daniel Fried, and they're suggesting that he was bribed in 2014. We also should mention that this VTB Bank has a branch in Angola, and that's very important because Angola is a major end destination for all of this money that's being laundered through another outfit called 88 Queensway Group.